Welcome everyone who's here now and on time to this webinar on effective and cost-effective targeting of subsidies. This is the first of a series of webinars that we're putting together on the design of demand-side subsidies. Federico Henriks from ESMAP Lighting Global, and I coordinate activities of the End User Subsidy Lab together with partners EnDev, GOGLA, and the Clean Cooking Alliance. Very happy to have seen so much interest in this. We've got 180 people signed up. I hope many of those will show up. And before I get started, just the typical housekeeping rules. I think we ask you to keep muted during the conversation. We welcome questions at any time through the chat, and we'll have all the participants that are involved here today answer them directly in the chat, and if not, we'll pick them up during the Q&A session at the end, or offline, depending on how much we get to do during the event. And I'm also encouraging my colleagues at the End User Subsidy Lab that are all here to also pick up questions that are directed to their organizations. So on the agenda, we have scheduled an hour and 15 for today's conversation. It would be me providing an introduction to this webinar on targeted subsidies and the work that we do at the End User Subsidy Lab, and then we'll move on to our guests, each of whom will have about 10 minutes of presentation before we move into a Q&A and discuss things in more detail. We have participants from the Alternative Energy Promotion Center of Nepal that will walk us through their decades of experience in targeted subsidies. Then we'll move on to GIZ EnDev in Malawi, who are doing an interesting subsidy scheme using an existing social protection system in the country. And finally, we'll have Emily Aiken from University of California, Berkeley, that will talk about what are our options for targeting when there are no such systems in place. If there's no social protection system or any other system that allows us to identify those that are vulnerable, what do we do then? And as I said, after that, we move into the Q&A session. You'll probably see we do not have, it's atypical, but we don't have private sector representation in the panel today, but many private sector companies in the room. And just wanted to say that we are very interested in your thoughts, and we encourage you to participate actively, give us your reactions, your comments, especially companies that have already been involved in subsidy programs. We want to know what works, what doesn't work, and use that as feedback. Before I move on, I want to have a quick sense of who's in the room. So I'm asking my colleague Brenda to launch a poll about the organization that best represents you. So what type of organization do you represent? Government, development agency, or financial institution, private sector, or other? Thank you for that. I think the results may be visible to you. It's an even split between development agencies, private sector, and other. I think next time we'll do a better job at getting government colleagues involved in this discussion, because that's critical. Moving on. Just for those who are not familiar with, sorry, I don't know if the results were shared of the poll, but I'm sharing them now. For those of you who are not familiar with the work that we do at the End User Subsidy Lab, we're a platform that look at promoting carefully designed and well-informed end user subsidies, and we do that by crowding in knowledge, by learning from projects that do subsidies that are ongoing or that have happened in the past, and draw lessons from those, offer this platform for exchange with a variety of stakeholders, create tools, and test prototypes on how to do subsidies. As I said before, we do this as a coordinated effort of ESMAP, EnDev, GOGLA, and the Clean Cooking Alliance, but we actively look for additional partners that are interested in these issues to join and discuss. What we want to do is to look to influence and use best practices to influence these projects that are doing subsidies in energy access. As part of the work that we do at the End User Subsidy Lab, we're now working on a framework for the design of demand-side subsidies. And just one clarification, I think through the presentation, you will see me talk about end-user subsidies, demand-side subsidies, or consumer subsidies. All of these mean the same. We have not yet standardized on one terminology, but I'm talking about the same thing. But back to this framework for the design of demand-side subsidies that is illustrated in that diagram that you see on the right of the screen in simple terms. It's a framework that would allow you to assess the context factors in a country or a region, and then break down the design of a subsidy in different components. The first of which is identifying who we want to benefit from a subsidy and how to target them. The second one is about what products should be eligible for a subsidy, what should be the subsidy level, then how you deliver that, and in particular, how do we work with the private sector to deliver a subsidy. Then how we verify that the subsidy has gone to the intended beneficiaries, and finally how we exit a subsidy when a certain project is over or when the objectives have been achieved. We are using this framework in the design of pilots that we're doing under the lab. EnDev is taking a lead on that. We have 4 pilot projects happening in Malawi, in Uganda, in Niger, and in Liberia that we are looking forward to learning a lot from. We're also producing a subsidy design toolkit with the help of Open Capital. This will be finalized by the end of the year, launched and made public for everyone to use. And we are hoping to also test this toolkit once it's done in a couple of countries that are doing significant subsidy projects for energy access. And the webinar today is part of this effort. What we are looking to do is to use each of these webinars to provide inputs to the framework, to improve it, to make it better. And we are doing each webinar about each specific aspect. So today is about targeting of subsidies. The next one in October will be about eligible products and subsidy level, and so on. And I'll reiterate that each of these webinars is an opportunity to get feedback and useful inputs that we can integrate into the framework, into what we'd call the best practice, and use that to influence specific projects that are grappling with this question of subsidy design. Why do we think, now specifically on targeting, why do we think targeting subsidies is important, and what we see are the options for targeting? I think for everyone that's here, I think we have a consensus that subsidies are needed to reach SDG 7. To illustrate, we have this graph on the right side that I pulled from the market trends report of GOGLA of last year. What that shows is that it's only 60% of the population without electricity access today that can afford a tier 1 solar home system. The remaining 40% cannot do that. So if we want to get to SDG 7, we'll have to find a way to make those affordable to them, subsidies being one of the key tools to do it. And the report also estimates that in order to provide that subsidy, or the amount of subsidy we'd need to reach that 40% of people that cannot afford systems, amounts to $4.5 billion. But what we believe is that if we had that amount available today, but we do not actively seek to target that to the people that are facing this affordability gap, the most likely thing to happen is that $4.5 billion would go to people that could afford commercial prices, people in urban areas, people that are better off, but that have a much easier access to a retailer, to an off-grid solar company, or to a supplier of clean cook stoves. It will be much harder for those that are poorer, that are more remote, more vulnerable, less aware. So this is where targeting comes in. And that's why we believe it is the responsible thing to do for effectiveness in reaching this intended population, these targeted beneficiaries, for cost effectiveness, for the resources that we've put into subsidies to be used for those that cannot afford products otherwise, and to minimize market distortion as well. We think that if we can manage the subsidized market to be limited, then we can leave market dynamics at play for the remainder of the market and minimize the risk of that distortion materializing. In terms of how we do this, we have different approaches that we're looking into. Each of them are different in terms of how accurate they are, in terms of the complexity of implementation, in terms of how much, what type and how much data is needed. And what we're planning to have in this toolkit that I was mentioning is a set of options for each of these elements of the subsidy. In the case of targeting, it's those that are listed in the column in the middle. Not necessarily exhaustive, but we have options such as targeting the population based on income or poverty. This would be the example of what the government of Rwanda is doing in the World Bank funded project REF, where we use the government's classification of their population for economic targeting. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have subsidies that are untargeted, which was, for example, the case of Nigeria's electrification project for solar home systems. And in between, other options that could be suitable in certain contexts. We'll hear from Nepal next, and they've done some targeting based on demographics or geographic areas. Whenever poverty or income is closely correlated with a certain demographic or a certain geographic area, it is a valid way of targeting. And by self-selection, we mean the case of providing proportionally higher subsidies to lower tier products, assuming that then those will be more attractive to poorer households, and then, well, the opposite would be true as well. Higher tier products that are more attractive to wealthier customers would have a lower subsidy, and that way we are managing to get more of this subsidy money to more vulnerable and poor populations. But what we're planning on doing is providing a toolkit that would have guiding questions to determine the context, decision trees to choose what the best option is for that context, and then case studies providing examples of how that has gone in the past in different projects. Not all of these options are feasible to begin with. It will depend on the context. And each of these options, or whichever are feasible, will have their pros and cons. There's no clear solution. And just to illustrate, when we do subsidies that are more targeted, we'll see less risk of long-term market distortion. We'll see more efficient use of subsidies, which are good things that we like. But then on the other hand, this will need more monitoring, and that will translate into more complex implementation for the government, but also for the private companies participating, and also issues like potentially social tensions between those that are eligible for subsidies and those that are not, if we're not communicating a subsidy properly. And then on the other hand, if we do something that's less targeted, it will be easier to implement, but then it's much more likely that that benefit will go to customers that don't need a subsidy. And we'll just have to balance in each case all of these issues when we make decisions on subsidy design. And before I hand over to the speakers, I just wanted to summarize what we'd like to get out of this. What are the key questions that we want to discuss during this session? And these are why targeted subsidies are important to reach SDG 7. Why are they the responsible thing to do? Why the best targeting option, or what is the best targeting option for a given project based on the context? And then what concerns we have with targeted subsidies or untargeted subsidies, and then how we can improve on what we are doing today. We want something ideally that is accurate, that is cost effective, and that is easy to implement. These are all conflicting objectives, but we're trying to find how we can best achieve those. Before handing over, there are also a couple of polls that I'm very keen on getting your feedback on. So Brenda, if you can launch poll number 2 to get an idea of how you feel about these issues, this issue of demand-side subsidies for off-grid solar and clean cooking. Should all demand-side subsidy projects, should all subsidies be targeted? Option 1 is yes, using the most accurate and feasible methods. Then option 2 depends on the subsidy amount. Option 3, as long as they're cost effective. Option 4, as long as they're not too complex to deliver. And option 5, no, subsidies should benefit the entire population regardless of their economic status. I'll now end the poll so we can move on. But what I'm seeing is that all of you agree that to some extent targeted subsidies are important, but then not necessarily that they should always be targeted, but it depends on a variety of factors, which is what I was anticipating. Thanks for that. And then there's a second poll before we move on, which is, what do you feel is the main challenge of delivering these targeted subsidies versus untargeted subsidies? Is it the difficulty of clearly identifying the eligible beneficiaries? Is it the administrative costs that companies have to incur to deliver subsidies? Is it cash flow issues for companies that get paid on results based? Is it social tensions, or is it other issues? I'll end the poll now. Thank you very much for that. And what comes up top is the difficulty of clearly identifying eligible beneficiaries at that company level. And this is one of the things that we're trying to provide best practices on. Thank you for that. And now I'll move on to our speakers, starting with Dr. Narayan Adhikari, a director at the Alternative Energy Promotion Center of the Government of Nepal. And he'll be talking about the importance of targeting the most vulnerable based on their decades of experience doing end user subsidies. And then we'll, after his 10-minute intervention, we'll move to the next two speakers. Narayan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Federico. Warm greetings from Nepal. At first, I sincerely thank organizing team of this End User Subsidy Lab for having me in this webinar and provide me an opportunity to share some of our experiences from Nepal. So basically, I work for Alternative Energy Promotion Center. This is the nodal agency. This is the nodal governmental agency which deals with promotion of renewable energy. So my institution is under Ministry of Energy, Water Resources and Irrigation. And I have been with AEPC since last 16 years and currently hold position of a director. And I'm coordinating technical division at my institutions. Let me allow to give some information of electrification. Where to go? Sorry. Okay. Actually, here we go. Actually, let me begin with the current energy access status and objectives. So if we see the electrification rate, recent years, the government of Nepal has, come up with very good electrification rate. You can see we have around 98% electrification rate. So of which 95% has been provided with integrated Nepal power system, that is the national grid, and for 3% that falls under AEPC's scope, where we have been implementing solar mini grids, different types of mini and micro hydropower. Nevertheless, solar home systems are there. So by combining these, we have an electrification rate of around 98%. So before arrival of national grid, 6% households of these INPS connected households, they have been provided with these off-grid solutions. So now we have a plan to integrate those systems in national grid as well. So now we have a plan to get full electrification. So government of Nepal at the moment has developed clear action plan to provide to reach 100% by 2024. So I'll provide some policy level amendments in later stage. So on the other hand, if we talk about clean cooking solutions, this has been really a challenge, like in other developing countries. So actually, if we see, still traditional biomass holds around 54% share. So of which 27% improved cooking stoves. So biogas is very minimal. In national level, it covers only 1.2%, whereas the LPG penetration has been skyrocketing. So that's one of the, I would say, problem for Nepal, because Nepal being net importer of this fossil fuel, I mean, it has really jeopardized national economy. So actually, being a rich in hydro, government's long-term plan is to provide induction or electric stove to all households. Nevertheless, we have to go a long journey for that, because although we do have very 98% electrification, but I mean, as one of the study conducted by ESMAP, it shows that we need to work hard to provide uh, electricity services of tier 3, meaning actually this if we plan to switch all these biomass stoves to electric stoves, the current electric infrastructure does not support. So that's one of the hurdle. So for that, we are thinking to provide other tier 3 level stoves or something like that. So however, this has also really been a challenge to achieve the target by 2030. Next slide, please. So our journey of subsidy starts during 1970s. So by intervening subsidy, these loans for water mill, improve water mill, our journey started. Later on, 50% of generation and distribution costs were subsidized to promote decentralized renewable energy in Nepal. So actually, after establishment of alternative energy promotion center in 1996, all these policy have been materialized. So afterwards, government of Nepal has come up with rural energy policy, renewable energy subsidy policy, renewable energy subsidy delivery mechanism. We do have different policy level documents. Based on that, we have been implementing our projects. So after establishment, we have started to provide 50% subsidy for generation and distribution, and 50% non-local cost were subsidized by one of our program, Renewable Energy for Rural Livelihood. That's the UNDP's program. So 50% of cost of solar home system also subsidized. So after implementing those programs based on these policies, what we realized that relatively better off households were getting those subsidies, and for poor and marginalized households, actually the result was not so promising. So on the one hand, and on the other hand, regular operation and maintenance, was very hurdle, because all these subsidies are one-time subsidy. So regular operation and maintenance, those technologies in remote areas have become quite challenges. Considering these facts, into 2013, we formulated policy to support to provide additional support to marginalized community, woman-headed households, and poor households, remotely located households, right? By targeting, we introduced targeting subsidies after 2013 based on our earlier experiences. Similarly, we also introduced a provision of providing subsidy to enhance load factor of this decentralized renewable energy. So actually, we wanted to link those renewable energy with income generating activities, for which we introduced productive energy use component. And for that also, we have provision subsidy. So Afterwards, federalization, started in Nepal. Right now, we have a 3 tier of government, of federal government, 7 provincial government, and 753 local governments. So, as per constitutions, the scope of renewable energy and providing basic services has been mandated to local government. So, what we realized that even providing subsidy in some cases up to 80%, 70%, that really didn't work in some of the areas, especially in remote areas. So on the one hand, we have to we were struggling to achieve this universal target of electrification. On the other hand, those places, those people are, I mean, really, those locations are really located in remote areas where people have very difficult lifestyle. So, and also the local government's aspirations, So all these, we considered all these things, and what the government of Nepal introduced is 90% of total project cost should be subsidized to those areas where no electrification exists. So those are really located in remote areas. So with this introduction, we have a plan to cover whole electrification throughout the country. So currently, actually, we have provisioned this subsidy up to 1 megawatt hydro and 250 kilowatt peak solar mini grid. So similarly, additional house wiring subsidy for women-aided household and extremely marginalized community exists. And this 80% referred that earlier in some of the projects we provided 80%, but that really didn't work. That's why government of Nepal has increased this subsidy amount. So next, please. So, a part of providing this capital subsidy, government of Nepal has also provision to provide subsidy to we call standalone system or domestic systems. For instance, solar home system, domestic biogas systems, improved cooking stoves of different varieties. So that's under end user subsidy. So what we are doing is, actually every fiscal year, government alternative energy promotion center, we published maximum retail price for all technologies, for each technologies with standards, technical standards, right? So we have a renewable energy test station, that's a government test station, which deals with all these technical standards. So also we published list of pre-qualified companies or competent companies for each technology services. So users can choose any of these pre-qualified companies for having these technologies at their home, right? So on the other hand, local government is there, who would verify all these installation and provide recommendation to provide subsidy to private companies. So based on which we have been providing subsidy amount directly to company on behalf of users. So actually for that, we have a targeted subsidy. For instance, we have a geographical target, we have an economic target, and demographics, of course. So actually what we did is, for geographic, we are using these geographic information systems. For economic classification, actually we rely on local governments recommendation. And for demographics, I mean, that's a very simple: women-led households with dependent children and earthquake victims that have already been identified, and government has a very good information of those targeted population. So based on which, we have been providing additional subsidy to those three fronts. Also, we have a central renewable energy fund. You can see, actually, AEPC, Central Renewable Energy Fund, CREF. That's a AEPC's financial mechanism, which provides loan, subsidy, grant, equity. Actually, they have introduced commercial banks, MFIs, to provide soft loan, to provide grant. So with this, in recent years, we have tried to link these commercial banks and MFIs into our subsidy channel. Next, please. So challenges in the delivery of subsidies. Actually, based on our experiences, actually, even we have a difficulty of this reaching more marginalized groups. Actually, in figure, it sounds very, I mean, simple. Only we have to reach 2% households, but that really, that those households are really locating in very, very remote areas, and the life of the population, we can't imagine. They have a very difficult life pattern. So it's a really difficult them to, expect their contributions. However, to address those, we have provisioned this additional subsidy, and we are also these days, we are also conducting awareness program in coordination with local government. So, what are the benefits of renewable energy? Why this is needed? How you can afford? What facilities are there? How MFIs can help, or something like that, right? So, those measures will be taken to address this difficulty, reaching to marginalized groups. Similarly, companies increase retail price. Actually, while providing this subsidy via private companies, I mean, there has been slight increment if we compare to retail price in market, because we have provisioned for after sale service, monitoring things are there, technical standards are there. So company has to take responsibility for smooth operation for certain years. It depends upon technologies, so that obviously demands money, right? So that increases the price of the technologies. So to address this, I mean, reverse auction technologies or aggregated demand. Earlier, IIED conducted one case study of AEPC, right? So what we discussed at that time, so aggregating those demands and practicing this reverse auction mechanism could reduce the cost of those technologies. So this has also been incorporated in our current subsidy policy. So we have been practicing this reverse auction mechanism as well. So other private companies, this while we see in view of private companies, so there should be some mechanisms so that private companies can boost their markets. They will not rely only on government subsidies. For that, what we introduced, we have recently introduced this Sustainable Energy Challenge Fund, right? For which private companies can come up with clear proposal for providing energy services. So based on that, government would provide a viability gap. So it depends upon technologies, it depends upon services, right? So
Dr. Narayan, I think we'll need to move on in the interest of time, but this is super interesting, and we can leave some of these for the Q&A session in the end. But I think you've covered everything. What I'm taking and that I find very interesting of this presentation is this fact that you've increased subsidies over time, but in order to do it, and in order to make sure that it goes to the people that you're intending, as you increase the subsidy, you also increase or restrict the beneficiaries through this targeting. And that came at an additional cost and additional complexity, like you're citing here, this issue of pricing, this issue of companies having models dependent on subsidies, which is what we are also seeing in African markets where I tend to operate. And we'd want to go back to these issues in the Q&A. But I'd also want to now switch to our colleagues at GIZ. Thanks a lot for this.
Thank you.
And the next presentation is from EnDev. And Khadija is going to walk us through the experience of EnDev in Malawi using an existing social protection system to channel subsidies to the most vulnerable.
Great, thanks, Fede. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll start my timer. My name is Khadija Musa. I'm from GIZ's EnDev program in Malawi, Energizing Development. And I'm going to present real quick on two types of targeting mechanisms that we've used for end user subsidies here in Malawi. And just highlight the different experiences we've had with both types of targeting. In terms of an overview, I think most of you on this webinar are familiar with EnDev, who we are and what we do. But for those of you who are not, EnDev is basically a partnership that basically focuses on SDG 7, so sustainable energy access for different types of populations, whether it's for clean cooking, for households, for enterprises, or for social institutions. And the focus that we have is mostly a market-based approach, but we do realize that there are different mechanisms in order to activate the market. And so one of the things that we do is make sure that we look at both the demand side of things, the supply side of things, as well as activating or enabling the environment that is going to be sufficient, or rather that's going to boost the reach for our products. One of the financing mechanisms, and I think this is the one we're going to focus on today, is a results-based financing mechanism. And we've been able to do this over the last, I think, 5 or so years. But basically, when we look at the work that we do, in as much as our main priority or focus is SDG 7, we found that a lot of the work that we do also touches on other SDGs as well. And in relation to the target populations, when it comes to end user subsidies, I think one of the most important would be SDG 3 for good health and well-being, as well as the SDG 5 on gender equality. So the results-based financing project that we did, I think since 2017, 2018, is where we looked at improved cook stoves for ultra-poor households in Malawi. And basically what we were doing with that is that we were looking at the fact that I think it's about 85, maybe close to 90% of the population in the country lives in the rural areas. So their primary source of energy is firewood. And you'll find that almost a majority of the population, 98% of all the households, are using solid fuels for cooking. So that also means that you have the situation, obviously, of some cases where people can't afford certain fuels, they can't afford energy access, depending on which geographical location they are in, or depending on their population group. So when we looked at the low income and the rural households, we figured, women, child-headed households, refugees, those are the vulnerable populations that likely have unequal access. Maybe they cannot afford it. So we needed to look at things such as ability to pay. So we also looked at a solution that would address inclusivity as well as affordability, so addressing that gap. And the hope for that was that in that approach would also catalyze a market for after sales, after those targeting mechanisms were used, so that we could make sure that there are proper structures that are set in place in those areas where we had gone to with our subsidy programs to make sure that affordability and availability are there, and accessibility as well when it comes to the last mile. So for the targeting mechanism that we used there, we collaborated with the government of Malawi through the Ministry of Gender rather. So the Ministry of Gender has a social welfare department, and it was under that department that they have a program called the Social Cash Transfer Program. And this is a scheme that looks at the most vulnerable households in the population. After looking at the entire population of Malawi, right now I think we're at about 20 million approximately. So 10% of that population is considered the most vulnerable households. And the Social Cash Transfer Program looks at a specific section of that 10% after they've done their own calculations in their databases, and they classify these people as the ultra poor. So these ultra poor individuals get a cash payment on a monthly basis. And while we were doing this targeting, we figured, okay, if we're going to go to areas where social cash transfer recipients are going to be targeted anyhow, we do understand that they're in certain communities, and there are other people in those same communities who have a bit of an ability to pay. So we would also add a commercial sales component to it, but we wouldn't make all our targeting strictly for social cash transfer, but a bit of it would also spill over into commercial sales, maybe about 10 to 20% of that target that we had, depending on the population of that district. The approach that we would use, I think, for the first 15 districts that we did this in, is where we distributed vouchers to over 135,000 social cash transfer households through the DFID funding. At the time, it was still DFID. And then after that funding was finished, I think we were approached by the GIZ Social Protection Program here in Malawi, who wanted to go to an extra district, so a 16th one, and they funded about 8,000 of those. What they would do is whenever the social cash transfer office would be going to the communities and handing out cash, or rather registering people for those cash payments, they would also distribute vouchers. So those vouchers could be used to redeem a stove for free, and this was strictly only for social cash transfer recipients. We engaged an international NGO known as United Purpose. At the time, it was called Concern Universal, and they were pretty much, they would pre-finance their project activities. Then they would receive the incentives for doing this program after we could verify the results of this distribution. So if you look at the graph that I have on screen now, is basically where Concern Universal was engaged by EnDev Malawi. They would find sales agents in every district they would go to. Then after they know, they would then go to improved cook stove producers, engage them and say, okay, we need this many stoves for this district that we're going to. And they would also go to the social cash transfer offices and verify the databases to see, are they still accurate from the time when they first received them to the time when they're actually distributing. So the stoves would then go and be distributed to the households, those who have the vouchers. So on the cash disbursement days, you would also go with your voucher, you would give it to a sales agent or an agent or promoter, if you want to call them that, and each agent had to keep those vouchers and then give them back to Concern Universal. Concern Universal then gives them to EnDev, and we would give them to an independent verifier. And this verifier would have to go back and use different mechanisms. Either they would call people, they would go to the actual homes, or they would check on the vouchers against the databases to make sure that the stoves actually went to the intended recipients. Of course, that approach does come with different challenges, especially in the rainy season here. A lot of places do become inaccessible. Now, remember, we're talking about last mile distribution here. So on the rainy season, you can see it gets quite muddy, and that would also delay implementation. You'd also find that the implementing partner, after they've submitted, it could take time for the verification to happen, and therefore that also takes time for the payment to happen for each claim, each RBF claim they would make, and that led to cash flow challenges because remember, they're having to pre-finance themselves in order to implement, so they wouldn't always be able to meet the timelines. Would also have changes from the government side on the social cash transfer beneficiary registry. Either they would change the schedules for when they're going to go and distribute cash, and not inform accordingly, or sometimes the databases would not be so accurate. Remember, these are people who are also like the elderly or people who maybe graduate from being from the social cash transfer program to what we call the enhanced public works program. So maybe they've got some income generating activities they've got going on and now they can afford, but they're still being listed in this database. So it was not accurately always monitored. You'd always find maybe somebody has passed on, it's not been updated. Maybe chiefs are giving their favorites in the village, they're listing them to be part of this registry, and yet they're not the intended recipients. Would also have the distribution between the stove producers as well as the retailers, that's the agents. Sometimes that could be disturbed, and that would also affect our commercial component. And lastly, you also had the issue of the lifespan of the stoves. Obviously, if the stoves have reached their lifespan, maybe you need to go back and provide them again. So what we learned was that overall, despite those challenges, the approach that we used was an efficient way for poor energy access subsidies. We made sure that the market, the drive of the market was able to improve the quality as well as the production volumes because we would monitor that. And then because we've got that commercial component, you'd find that word of mouth is assisting in people actually purchasing stoves afterwards. So the uptake was quite high and we're able to reach those low-income households with higher incentives. In terms of our results, one household is about 4.4 people, according to the Malawi government. So if you calculate that with over 135 households that were reached with this, we're able to sustain the production of the stoves. We're able to use a targeted end user approach and had a sufficient network of agents across the board. And each and every single stove purchase was verified. I think there were about 12 rounds of verification and about 400,000 euros approximately that were given in terms of incentives. When we then look at the approach that we've now changed now after those lessons that we learned, we've got a demand-side subsidy component. And this time we're not only looking at cook stoves, but we're also incorporating solar lighting, off-grid solar lighting. And this is the project where we're partnering together with the World Bank for with regard to the scaling up of this project after the different lessons that we learned. This is a project we're doing with funding from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, and we're targeting about 4 districts with this in all the 3 regions. So one thing we want to make sure, though, is that we ensure that we do not harm in our approach. So we've changed the targeting a bit. We're not using the social cash transfer anymore, but we're using what's known as the Unified Beneficiary Registry of the government, and this is under the Ministry of Economic Planning. So the UBR, basically what they've done is they've gone into each and every single district, they've calculated the entire population, and they've made sure that everyone is classified, whether they're rich, they're better off, they're poor, they're poorer, or they're poorest. And we've decided to go to the poorer and the poorest of this population and provide a subsidy amount that is calculated to address the affordability gaps of those two population groups. So we're not giving the products for free anymore because we want to encourage ownership. And we're going to be using, once again, an RBF scheme for this. But on top of the voucher distribution system that we're using last time, we're going to link it to the UBR, but we're also going to try and use a digital mode. We're going to use an SMS code. And then again, we'll have the robust monitoring, the third-party monitoring verification that we do in the past. I think I saw earlier that there was a question where somebody was asking with regard to ability to pay. So for the cook stoves, I think we've got quite sufficient data on that. But on the off-grid solar side of things, we had to rely on some data that was done by some World Bank studies as well as Sustainable Energy for All. And we found that under that poorest category, approximately 10% of those households did manage to report something that they spend on lighting for off-grid lighting rather. And then in the poorer, you found about approximately 40% of those. So looking at that type of targeting, for the solar, we had to see, okay, this is the amount that people are able to pay. This is the affordability gap based on the actual price of the approximate price of the products that we want to distribute. So we found that about 73% of the poorer category could afford an average price, and 88% of the poorest could possibly afford. And then on the cook stove side of things, because the cook stove is slightly cheaper, you find that the affordability gap is still almost similar, and then you only have the willingness to pay, which we had to take from existing government studies that we have there. So you find that the poorer there are at about 85% of the average price that are able to pay, and 89% for the poorest. We're using a similar model to what we did before, only that the difference this time is that instead of we're using the same fund manager that we used in the past, but instead of this being directly between EnDev and the project itself, the fund manager is now in charge of handling the company. So the fund manager has to select, they have to make sure that the products are of the right quality, and they have to make sure that they engage in independent verify to make sure that we're actually reaching the right people. So the UBR is a bit different in the sense that that one has actually looked at the people. It is updated, I think, on a regular basis, it's on an annual basis, and countrywide, they've done about 15 districts out of the 29 that we have. I think by the end of the year, they would have added another 7, if not 8 more districts. And that one is more verified, and it actually addresses the right people for these types of subsidies. I've gone over time just a little bit, but I hope not by too much. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks. And I'll answer any questions in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Khadija. Lots of information. I just wanted to pick up on that last slide that you showed, that is saying that if we want to target the poorest, we need to come up with subsidies that can be as high as 80%. I think you went even as 90%. So clearly, if we are thinking of subsidies that are that high, they will have to be targeted. Otherwise, the impact on a market would be disastrous. And then you've done a good job by doing that using the social protection scheme in Malawi and coupling that with vouchers. And this is so now it's at the scale of a pilot or a relatively small project, but it could be something that we could scale as part of a bigger electricity access project of the government or funded by the World Bank. And we got your perspectives on the advantages and disadvantages of this, but I'm just wondering if those in the audience can also tell us what they think about this voucher mechanism, about us detecting those who are most vulnerable and eligible for subsidies, and then rolling out a voucher scheme. Some of the companies in the chat in the room may have already dealt with this in other projects, and I'd like to know from their perspective: is this something that can be scaled? Or the reverse logistics too complicated? So I'd be keen to have those comments in the chat as we go into the next presentation. So I'm going back to sharing my screen and inviting Emily from University of California. And as I said before, in some countries we may have a system of social protection like Khadija was explaining, but in most of the countries where we're likely to work on subsidies do not have such a system that we can use, and we'll need to come up with a way of targeting subsidies. And they've done this, they've devised a clever way of doing this in a different context, but something that we could learn from for energy access. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, maybe a couple just quick caveats before I launch into my presentation. First, I'm an academic, so I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, but I've worked a lot with governments as well as NGOs and multilateral organizations. So I'm talking today about a partnership between my research team at UC Berkeley and then the government of Togo that took place in the last few years. And then I guess second caveat, I don't know that much about the energy sector. I'm actually from the social protection sector, but I think both of these sectors are going to think a lot about how to reach the poorest people and how to identify and target the poorest people. And so I'm hopeful that some of the lessons we learned in designing a social protection cash transfer scheme that tried to reach the poorest people will also be useful for you all in terms of thinking about targeting end user subsidies. Okay, so with that, I will launch in. You can go ahead to the next slide. Perfect. So like I said, like in targeting subsidies, the challenge of targeting social protections is very large. Governments want to invest large amounts into cash transfer programs or other benefit programs in social protection systems, but they typically don't have enough budget to help everyone. So they're going to try to only provide benefits to the people who are poorest. Go ahead. But we heard just now about an effective targeting system in Malawi, but the truth is that many countries lack recent and reliable data to use for targeting. And again, this could be targeting of cash transfers, it could be targeting of food baskets, it could be targeting of social protections, but it also is the case for subsidies. And so we heard about in Malawi a program that sort of piggybacked on the existing social protection targeting system. But the question I'm going to try to provide somewhat of an answer to is what might you do when there is no such system available? Basically, half of the poorest countries haven't conducted a census in the past 10 years, let alone a census that contains information on poverty. And social registries are often, not complete or out of date. And so there really are a large number of countries that are in this situation where they want to provide benefits, they want to provide perhaps subsidies, but there's not good up-to-date data to use to identify who is wealthy and who is poor. And so I'm going to talk about what our work in Togo, which was in exactly such a context. Yeah, feel free to continue. So I'm going to talk about a cash transfer program that we helped design in Togo called Novisi. This was a cash transfer program during the COVID pandemic. So not only does Togo not have a social registry, they don't have an existing, database on which households or individuals are wealthy and poor, but they also had no ability to go out and collect that information because it was during the COVID pandemic. Nonetheless, the government of Togo launched this entirely digital cash transfer program during the pandemic to provide cash transfers to poor individuals via mobile money. Eligible beneficiaries received about $20 per month for between 3 and 6 months, depending on which part of the program they were enrolled in. And the program worked pretty well from the perspective of people were, in general, able to register via their phone for this cash transfer program, and if eligible, receive benefits via mobile money. But the program started by targeting informal workers in the cities, sort of, excuse me, sorry, under the assumption that the cities were most impacted by COVID lockdowns and informal workers would be the most vulnerable. But they wanted to expand the program into rural areas, and that's where they approached our research team at UC Berkeley about helping to design a targeting approach in rural parts of the country, which are the poorest parts of Togo. And this is the targeting approach that I hope will be perhaps informative for some of you all to think about. So we basically developed a two-pronged targeting approach for identifying eligible beneficiaries for this program in Togo. The first was to identify eligible geographies. At the very beginning, Federico talked through sort of this hierarchy of targeting approaches, and one of the approaches that might help is geographic targeting. So just identifying the poorest areas to be eligible for, in my case, cash transfers or for subsidies. I think this is generally a good approach, but a challenge in Togo is that not only did they not have an up-to-date social registry, they didn't even have an up-to-date survey that provided a poverty map of sufficient granularity to do targeting, geographic targeting at even the regional level. And so we used some recent developments in the machine learning literature to build such a poverty map using satellite imagery. And the intuition here is really that Satellite images contain a lot of information that is predictive of poverty. You can think about like, you can see the density of houses in satellite images. You can see what materials are used for roofs, the quality of roads, access to water, all of that's visible in satellite images. The problem is just having a way to sort of extract that information and use it to actually produce a poverty estimate for each village. The answer, or a good approach here, is to use what's called supervised learning or machine learning, where we basically use a small survey to train a machine learning model to predict poverty from the satellite images. And then we can use that machine learning model to predict poverty in every single satellite tile in the country. And that's what I'm showing in the middle panel of this map. And then we can aggregate together those predictions at like any administrative boundary level. In Togo, we worked at the canton level, which is sort of going to be equivalent to like counties in the US. And then we identified the 100 poorest cantons to be eligible for this cash transfer program, and that's what I'm showing in the right panel of the map. So this is how we identified eligible geographies for the program. I want to briefly say that this approach is very generalizable. It could be taken in basically any country. It would be relevant in any country that does not have an up-to-date map of poverty to use for targeting. And in fact, in a separate paper, my research group released these poverty predictions for every low and middle income country in the world at the 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer satellite tile level. And that's like a publicly available free data product online. So that could be potentially useful for people who are thinking about administering these geographically targeted programs. All right, on to the next slide. But in our context in Togo, the government didn't have enough budget to provide benefits to every individual living in the eligible geographies, and they wanted to also do, as we were talking about in some of the other presentations here, some amount of individual or household targeting to make sure that benefits really went to the poorest. So a second step of our targeting approach was inferring individual level poverty from mobile phone metadata. We got all the metadata from Togo's 2 mobile network operators. This is information about like this subscriber called this other subscriber at this time via this cell tower. And so we can use this metadata to basically get basic statistics about, how many calls each subscriber is making, how many contacts, patterns of mobility based on cell tower usage, and so on. Then we want to infer an index of poverty from these statistics. Again, this is basically a supervised learning problem, but the intuition is that, wealthy people use their phones differently than poor people. So wealthy people are likely to make more calls, to have more international calls, more mobility based on cell tower use. And so to some extent, we can differentiate the wealthy from the poor using mobile phone data. Next slide, please. And so we do this, as I mentioned, via supervised learning. We're going to, again, train a machine learning model using a small survey with ground truth data to predict poverty from the mobile phone statistics, and then use that model to predict poverty for every subscriber in the country. And then when people registered for the program via their phone, only subscribers with estimated poverty below a certain threshold were eligible for the program, and we were able to pay about the poorest 25% of subscribers who register. Next slide. In our paper, which we published on the cover of Nature like a couple of years ago now, which is kind of crazy, we evaluated the accuracy of these targeting approaches. So I encourage you to check that out in the paper if you're interested. But very briefly, on the graphs I'm showing, I'm looking at metrics like precision, recall, and area under the curve score. For all these metrics, higher is better. So you can just look at what's the higher bar. And importantly, what we can see is that the phone-based targeting approach shown in green was more accurate than simpler approaches based on, say, occupation or geography, or even an asset index. Next slide. I'm going to skip this one for time since I'm almost out of time, so let's keep going. All right, so just to wrap up, I want to articulate a few concerns that you might have, or at least I have, about using phone data and satellite imagery for targeting that you might not have about some of these more traditional demographic or survey-based targeting approaches that were discussed in the previous 2 presentations. For one thing, you should definitely consider digital exclusion. So the idea that people who don't own phones are likely to be the poorest, the most vulnerable, but they wouldn't even appear in this targeting approach based on phone data. For context, 65% of individuals own a phone in Togo. In the Novisi program, we didn't produce additional exclusions with the targeting approach because the program was already being delivered over the mobile phone. But I'd say that's a big concern for like other programs like subsidies that are considering taking this up. There's other concerns I can get into in the Q&A around like phone ownership in terms of phone sharing and people having multiple SIMs, as well as things like privacy. Obviously, phone data is personally sensitive. And so we had a number of steps to protect privacy, and we're continuing to work on that area, as well as questions around fairness, algorithmic transparency, data sharing, data security, and of course, this like general surveillance concern. And so I'm happy to get into any more of that in the Q&A, but I think I'll leave it there. And yeah, I guess we move on to Q&A now. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Emily. I'll ask you a follow-up question as I have the time to look into the questions of the people in the chat. I was just wondering if we were to roll out this approach for the energy sector, for instance, in a new country, not the case of Togo. What would it take for you to be able to produce the poverty map that you produced for Togo, and then just consider what would you consider if we wanted to do individual targeting like you did with phones? Would that be feasible or not? Any other ideas of what other sources of data we could tap into?
Yeah, maybe I can also address one of the questions in the Q&A at the same time as answering that, which is Dimitri asked about how easy it was to get like actual current satellite imagery. On the satellite imagery side, I think, as I mentioned, I see that approach as like extremely feasible for replication. So in our work, we relied on private satellite imagery. It's generally private satellite imagery is higher resolution than the publicly available stuff, but it's also more expensive. So we relied on up-to-date high-resolution private satellite imagery to produce those poverty estimates. But like I said, we then produced them for like every low and middle income country in the world using data from 2022 or 2021. So those data are already publicly available online, like those estimates, and could directly be integrated into a program. That being said, code is also publicly available to produce these estimates at this point from several different groups. And so it wouldn't be very hard either for a data scientist to basically take the publicly available satellite imagery, which is available from both the US and EU space agencies. And that's updated roughly every 2 weeks, I believe, and is also at a reasonable resolution at this point. And so there really is publicly available satellite imagery and publicly available code that could be paired together to produce these estimates at any given time. So I think that's a really exciting and sort of open source, publicly available approach to do really fine-grained geographic targeting. And I think that's something I'm really excited about going forward. And then briefly to your question about phone data and other sources of data, I think the phone data approach is definitely more challenging to replicate. It relies on having good relationships with the mobile network operators in country. It relies on being able to like legally share that data, and that depends on the sort of data protection clauses, and that's a country-specific thing as well. And so I think when I think about, people come to me and say, I want to replicate that phone-based targeting approach in XYZ country, my first question is usually, how feasible would it be to work with the mobile network operators in this country to make this happen? So relying on that private data is always a bigger challenge. That being said, we're currently replicating that approach in Bangladesh as well as in Haiti. And so it certainly is replicable, but it relies on a lot more private sector partners. And then to your last point about other sources of data that could be interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really interested in like digital data generally. And I think there's a lot of other data sources that can inform poverty targeting. You could think about like internet data, data from financial services companies. And then one thing I think we talked about before that's really interesting to me is it seems like as these subsidy programs are being rolled out, a lot of data is being collected by about the beneficiaries of those programs. Like perhaps there's an agent of the company that's visiting these people and actually verifying certain things about them, and perhaps that data could also be rolled in to the targeting, and that to me is a really interesting potential avenue. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. And we are we're about to run out of time, so I'll just address one quick question to Narayan and one for Khadija based on what I'm seeing in the chat. The one for Nepal is about using information from the local government level, and there's this question about using this local government structures to identify people who should get subsidies. Does this always work, or when we go to the village level or the smallest administrative units, there's a risk of the people that are being identified to well, not to be realistic, but rather based on other interests? So that is the one that I have for Nepal. And then for Khadija, there's a question about the voucher system, and if you had any issues in the past about vouchers being falsified, or well, issues about implementations of subsidies more generally. And before I let you answer, I noticed there are questions also about the subsidy level, and a mention that I made about such high subsidies, such as 90% and so on, being distortive of the market. I think that merits quite a long discussion. I mean, what I tried to say during my presentation was that if we calculate a subsidy based on an affordability gap of the poorest people, and that takes us to 90%, if we mainstream that subsidy level to the entire population, it would be extremely expensive on the one hand, but it would also, well, it would just be difficult to go back to a market dynamic after doing that. But I think that we'll have a more extensive discussion about that in the next webinar, which is about the subsidy level and how that relates to targeting, how that relates to market distortion. And I'm happy to also take that conversation one-on-one or with the End User Subsidy Lab at any point. Having said that, Dr. Narayan, do you have comments on the first question?
Thank you, Federico. Actually, the question is really pertinent. Actually, the targeted subsidy, for providing this targeted subsidy, actually one should submit their citizenship, right? So citizenship is one of the major document. That's not only local government simply recommend. Actually, we need clear-cut household citizenship of household member. So actually, in center we have a data of all these, who earlier got subsidy from our. So based on that, we can easily identify whether that particular households will be eligible to get subsidy. If we see this Dalit, low-casted, households, so those are identified from there. For marginalized community, for remoteness things, actually it is the company, who will visit that places. So based on his informations and based on recommendation, so we have been providing this subsidy. So for that particular domestic household systems, from our experiences, we do not see that much of problem.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Khadija?
Yeah, I think you addressed the question with regard to any issues that we potentially had with vouchers being falsified. So I did answer the question in the chat there, but I could just quickly also touch on the fact that I said, well, not in terms of duplication as such. I won't say that didn't happen at all. Obviously, you do have instances where somebody tries, but remember, these would be the most remote of locations. So chances are even that the technologies or your computers and printers and that kind of thing wouldn't always be available. What we did face though would be the fact that the vouchers, and when we're doing this RBF under the DFID funding, the implementing partner would print a voucher, but then with regard to the actual serial number of that of the stove, it would be written on the day, and then the name of the person would also be written on the day of the cash voucher distribution. So the name of the person could always be the wrong person. Sometimes there's a risk that you would face there. It could be that somebody decides, you know what, I'm not going to give it to the rightful person, I'm going to give it to someone else instead. So you face that risk. So what we did the next time when SPP, the Social Protection Program, engaged us, we got the actual database. And I think the reason why we didn't do this before was because it was a larger population that we're targeting versus the SPP one where it was just one district, is we looked at the database and we literally typed And I remember I did it myself. I typed the names of each and every single person for each and every single voucher to make sure that they would go to the actual right person. And the only handwritten part would be the stove serial number that the people would get written on that voucher. So that was another way to try and curb those falsifications. Again, you also have situations of people who share names here. So it could be that the wrong person, comes and claims when they're not really John Amos, but there's like 5 John Amoses in the village, and one of them happened to pick up an old lady's voucher and decides, I'm going to go and claim. There's certain things you can't mitigate everything, but you try as much as you can to mitigate the risks.
Thank you for that. And we just have 3 minutes left. I'll be quick about the conclusions, and I don't think we've been able to cover every question or every issue that is important about targeting, but at least the idea was to get this conversation started. And on conclusions, I think in the initial poll there was some agreement that targeting is important. I think no one said no, there should not be targeting. So there's good. It's good that there's consensus about it being responsible to conserve public resources and minimize market distortion. Target is, however, challenging. Some compromises need to be made. And one particular challenge that we have not discussed in depth is the cost of targeting. We've discussed mechanisms to target using the social cash protection system or rolling out digital systems like the one in Togo, but that has a cost. And we are actively also thinking about that part. How far should we go to make sure we do something that is as accurate as possible? We're also balancing the challenges of these market mechanisms, and I'd say it gets more complicated as we're dealing with the poorest, but there are more trade-offs that we do when we're targeting a bigger part of the population that are facing a smaller affordability gap. So we try to do an approach that is proportional to the affordability gap being faced and the subsidy level that we're dealing with. And we'll definitely talk more about that in the next webinar. And finally, most consumer subsidies, I think, will be needed in places where we have poor data, where we have poor systems, which makes targeting difficult. And we are actively thinking about approaches like the one presented by Emily to figure out how we'll go about these issues. So I'd say your feedback of everyone here is very welcome on that. So feel free to reach out. My email address is there. My colleagues' email address from GOGLA is also there. As I said before, we'll have a next webinar that will focus on subsidy levels. So there's quite a lot of these topics that we'll get a chance to discuss again. And as I said before as well, we're working on this demand-side subsidy toolkit that will be launched by the end of the year. Until then, anything you tell us will integrate into that. So having said that, thanks a lot for staying until the end, and looking forward to further exchanges with you. Have a good day. Thank you, everyone. Bye.